The structure that rose on Mykola Pohrebnyak's quarter section in the Spring Creek Valley of South Dakota was not a cabin. In the summer of 1896, as his neighbors raised frames of milled pine and cottonwood, Mykola was building something that looked more like geology than carpentry. He had erected a series of curved iron arches, forming a long, low tunnel, and then he began to cover it. Not with sod, not with planks, but with a thick, heavy coat of river clay and straw, mixed by foot in a shallow pit. By September, the iron had vanished completely, buried under a seamless earthen mantle 30 inches thick. It no longer looked like a building. It looked like a hill, a strange, perfectly smooth burial mound dropped onto the prairie. His neighbors, men who understood the straightforward logic of post and beam, watched him with a mixture of pity and contempt. They called it Pohrebnyak's folly, or the mud turtle. Asa Crittenden, the county surveyor, a man who trusted the clean lines of his transit and the unyielding truth of a Gunter's chain, was more precise in his dismissal. He saw Mykola tamping the wet, heavy mixture onto the convex arches and shook his head. He knew the weight of earth and the properties of water. This strange structure wasn't just foolish, it was a temporary foolishness, a monument to ignorance that would surely collapse in on itself by the first spring thaw, if not sooner. The question that echoed through the valley, from the general store to the blacksmith's forge, was simple. How could a man expect to survive a Dakota winter inside a damp pile of dirt? Why would anyone trade the proven strength of timber for a home made of mud? The answer, buried in that 30-inch wall, was a secret of physics that the prairie had not yet learned. Before we unearth the principles that allowed this strange hill to defy the worst freeze in Dakota memory, I want to invite you to become part of our community of historical explorers. If you believe that the wisdom of the past holds lessons for the future, take a moment to subscribe to our channel. I promise that by the end of this story, you will understand the profound science of thermal mass in a way that feels tangible and real. And let us know in the comments, what's the most unconventional but effective solution to a problem you've ever witnessed? We read every response. Your support allows us to continue digging up these forgotten histories of ingenuity. Mykola Pohrebnyak was not a carpenter. He had never framed a wall with 2x4s, never cut a dovetail joint, never shingled a roof. In his world, a home did not rise from a stack of lumber. It grew from the ground beneath your feet. He was from a small village in the Poltava Oblast of Ukraine, a land of sweeping grasslands not unlike the Dakota prairie, but with winters that carried a different kind of teeth, a damp, penetrating cold, born on the vast Eurasian steppe. He was a builder of mazanki, the traditional wattle and daub houses of his homeland. His hands knew the specific heft of river clay, the smell of chopped straw curing in the sun, the satisfying thud of a wooden mallet tamping the wet mixture into a woven lattice of willow branches. The tools of his trade were not saws and nail guns, but shovels, troughs, and the weight of his own body. He understood that a wall's purpose was not merely to stop the wind, but to breathe, to absorb, and to hold. He had come to America with his wife, Olena, and their young son, Taras, drawn by the promise of 160 acres of his own. The Homestead Act was a dream rendered in black ink on a government map. But the dream soured during their first winter in 1895. They had spent what little money they had on a hastily built frame cabin, the kind the land agents promoted as modern and efficient. It was a box made of thin pine boards, nailed together and chinked with old rags. It was a disaster. That first winter became a litany of small sufferings that compounded into a near-constant state of misery. The green lumber of the walls shrank in the dry Arctic air. The frame walls cracked at every nailhead, opening up 100 tiny mouths that breathed in the Dakota winter. Wind, fine as dust, sifted through the gaps, leaving little dunes of snow on the floorboards overnight. Their cast-iron stove, a source of fierce pride for the American settlers, became a tyrant. It had two states, roaring inferno and inert lump of cold metal. When fed with precious cottonwood, its sides would glow a dull red, scorching the air in a 5-foot circle, making the room feel suffocating and dry. Terrace's skin grew chapped and raw. Olena's hands, trying to cook near its blistering surface, were constantly burned. Yet 10 feet away, in the corners of the single room, the temperature was barely above freezing. Ice rimmed every window pane, thick and opaque, a cataract of frost that blocked the weak winter sun. Water left in a bucket overnight would be solid by morning. They wore their coats to bed, huddled under every blanket they owned, and still woke up shivering, their breath pluming in the frigid air. Mykola burned through his entire woodpile by February and had to trade his spare axe and 2 sacks of seed grain for more at an exorbitant price. He watched his family's health and spirits wither in that flimsy wooden box, and he knew it was a fundamentally flawed design. It was a trap, not a shelter. It worked against the world, and the world was winning. The failure of Mykola's cabin was not unique. It was the shared, unspoken misery of the entire Spring Creek Valley. The conventional American frontier cabin was an import from the forested, milder climates of the East. In Ohio or Pennsylvania, a log cabin chinked with moss and daub was a fortress. On the vast, windswept plains of South Dakota, it was a sieve. The physics of its failure were brutal and absolute. The primary problem was a near total lack of thermal mass, compounded by catastrophic heat loss through conduction and air infiltration. A standard 1-inch pine board has an R value, a measure of thermal resistance, of about 1. Even with sheathing and an interior wall, the total R value of a typical cabin wall was less than 3. The minus 20 degrees Fahrenheit air outside was separated from the living space by what was, thermally speaking, little more than a sheet of cardboard. Heat, measured in British thermal units or BTUs, poured through these thin walls, seeking the colder exterior air with relentless efficiency. For every square foot of wall, hundreds of BTUs were lost every hour. The settlers' only weapon against this constant hemorrhaging of heat was the iron stove. But the stove heated the home through convection. It warmed the air. This created a vicious cycle. The hot air would rise to the ceiling, rush across to the cold exterior walls, cool rapidly, and sink to the floor, creating a constant chilling draft, even with the doors and windows sealed. You were either being baked by the radiant heat of the stove or chilled by the convection currents it created. There was no comfortable medium. Furthermore, the design itself was a collection of thermal bridges. Every nail, every joint where 2 pieces of wood met, was a pathway for heat to escape. Mykola's neighbors, the Millers, a family from Illinois, spent their autumn stuffing every crack they could find with newspaper and rags. Their cabin was considered one of the tightest in the valley. Yet by January, they were burning 12 cords of wood, a staggering amount, and their children were perpetually sick with coughs that rattled in their chests. The inside of their window panes were layered with an inch of ice, built up from the condensation of their own breath, freezing against the cold glass. The structure was failing on a fundamental level. It could produce heat, but it could not hold it. The settlers were trying to solve the problem with more fuel, a brute force approach that was exhausting their resources and their bodies. They were pouring water into a bucket full of holes, and the prairie winter was a limitless ocean of cold. Mykola knew you didn't need a bigger bucket. You needed a different bucket. In the spring of 1896, as soon as the ground thawed enough to be worked, Mykola began. He did not hire a sawyer or buy lumber. He took his wagon and 2 sturdy horses down to the railhead in Pierre. There he purchased a stack of corrugated iron sheets, surplus from a government contract. They were designed as roofing for sheds or culverts, but Mykola saw in their curve the shape of the steppe, the arch of the sky. Back on his claim, he and Olena, with the help of a neighbor he paid in potatoes, bolted the sheets together, forming a long, semicircular tunnel, like a giant Nissen hut, 60 feet long and 20 feet wide. It sat on a shallow foundation of fieldstone. Asa Crittenden, the surveyor, stopped by one afternoon in July while marking out a new section line. He watched Mykola tightening bolts with a heavy wrench. "An iron house, Mr. Pohrebnyak?" he asked, his voice laced with professional skepticism. "It'll be an oven in the summer and an icebox in the winter. That metal will conduct the heat right out." Mykola just wiped the sweat from his brow and nodded. "Iron is only the bone," he said. "The flesh is coming." The flesh was the earth itself. He dug a massive pit near Spring Creek, where the clay was rich and gray. He filled it with water, and then he and Olena began the grueling work of mixing. They dumped in load after load of straw from the previous year's wheat harvest. Then they took off their boots, rolled up their trousers and skirts, and began to tread the mixture, walking in slow circles, their feet sinking into the cool, thick slurry. Taras, their son, laughed as he watched, calling it the mud dance. For weeks, the only sounds from the Pohrebnyak homestead were the rhythmic squelch of feet in the clay pit and the creak of the wagon hauling the finished mixture, a substance called salmon in his language, to the iron arch. This was when the construction's signature moment occurred, the act that cemented his reputation as a fool in the eyes of his neighbors. Mykola loaded a wooden hod with the wet, impossibly heavy clay straw and carried it to the arch. He took a deep breath, and with a powerful heave, he slapped the first load against the corrugated iron. It made a wet, percussive smack, a sound utterly alien to the crisp tap-tap of a hammer on a nail. The mud clung to the curve, held in place by the straw fibers and the ridges of the iron. He then used a wooden float to press and smooth it, working from the bottom up. He was plastering his house with mud. Day after day, the process repeated. Load, slap, smooth. The layer grew thicker, an inch at a time. It was slow, back-breaking labor. The sun beat down, and the clay began to dry, forming a hard crust while the inside remained damp. By late August, the iron skeleton had completely disappeared beneath a growing earthen shell. It was now nearly 2 feet thick. This was when Asa Crittenden returned. He set up his transit, ostensibly to check his last survey pin, but his gaze was fixed on the bizarre mound. He walked over, his boots making precise, neat prints in the dusty soil. He watched Mykola and Olena applying another layer of the clay straw. "I've done the calculations, Mr. Pohrebnyak," Crittenden said, foregoing any pleasantries. His tone was not unkind, but it was the firm, confident voice of a man who deals in facts. "Based on the dimensions of this arch and the density of wet clay, you have approximately 30 tons of earth sitting on that frame." 30 tons. He paused for effect. "It may hold now while it's drying, but come the spring thaw, when the frost leaves the ground and this entire mass becomes saturated with meltwater, the sheer weight and lubrication will cause it to slump. It's basic physics. It will slide right off this curve. You'll be left with a bare iron shell and a 30-ton pile of mud on your floor." Mykola stopped his work. He looked at the surveyor, then at his wall, then at the hot September sun. He did not argue about slump angles or soil mechanics. He offered a simple, quiet statement of faith in a different kind of physics. "The sun will bake it first," he said. "It will be stone. The winter will freeze it into one piece." He then turned back to his work, patting the mud into place with his hands. Crittenden stood there for a moment, a man armed with numbers and theories, watching a man armed with a shovel and a memory. The surveyor shook his head slowly, packed up his instrument, and left Mykola to his folly. By the first frost in October, the wall was 30 inches thick, a massive, seamless shell of sun-baked clay and straw. Mykola had built a small stone facade on the front with a sturdy door and 2 small, deep-set windows. From the side or the back, it was indistinguishable from a natural feature of the landscape. It was a hill that had grown on the prairie. To understand why Mykola Pohrebnyak's mud hill was a marvel of thermal engineering, one must first forget the logic of the timber cabin. A timber cabin is a barrier. A mazanka is a battery. The entire principle rests on the concept of thermal mass, the ability of a material to absorb, store, and release heat. Wood is a poor material for thermal mass. It is light and porous. A cubic foot of pine weighs about 25 pounds. It heats up quickly, and it cools down just as fast. The heat from a stove warms the surface of a wooden wall, but very little of that energy is absorbed into the wood itself. The heat remains in the air, where it is quickly lost through drafts and conduction. Now consider Mykola's wall. It was a composite of clay and straw. A cubic foot of this packed earth mixture weighs over 100 pounds. It is dense, solid, and contains very few air pockets. Critically, it possesses a high specific heat capacity. This means it takes a tremendous amount of energy to raise its temperature. A pound of clay requires 4 times more BTUs to raise its temperature by 1 degree Fahrenheit than a pound of wood does. Mykola's structure contained over 60 tons, 120,000 pounds, of this material. Throughout the day, his small, efficient stove was not just heating the air inside the home. It was slowly, steadily, pouring thousands of BTUs of heat energy into the immense thermal battery of the walls. The heat soaked into the clay, traveling slowly through the 30-inch thickness. By evening, the entire earthen shell was saturated with warmth, like a gigantic, low-temperature kiln. When Mykola banked the stove for the night and the fire died down to embers, the physics of the house reversed. In a timber cabin, this was the moment the cold began its assault, the temperature plummeting within the hour. In Mykola's earthen home, this was the moment the walls began to give their stored heat back. The massive warm shell now became a gentle, radiant heater. It released its stored thermal energy incredibly slowly, at a rate of less than 1 degree Fahrenheit per hour. The surface of the interior wall, warm to the touch, radiated heat evenly throughout the space, warming objects and people directly, not just the air. There were no drafts, no cold spots. The temperature remained remarkably stable, dropping only a few degrees overnight even as the prairie winds howled outside. Asa Crittenden's mistake was in seeing the mud as a simple load, a dead weight. He was a surveyor. He thought in terms of statics. Mykola was a mazanka builder. He thought in terms of dynamics. He knew the clay was not just structure. It was a living, breathing part of the shelter's climate system. The American settlers were trying to fight winter with a thin shield and a roaring fire. Mykola had built a reservoir. He spent his days slowly filling it with warmth and his nights peacefully drawing from it. That winter, the winter of 1896, arrived with a particular fury. It was not the gentle snows of November, but a hard, killing cold that settled over the plains in the first week of December and did not relent. The sky turned a metallic gray, and the wind began to blow, a low moan that grew into a constant, shrieking gale. Then came the snow. It did not fall. It flew. A prairie-ground blizzard descended upon Spring Creek Valley, a whiteout of horizontal ice crystals driven by 60-mile-per-hour winds. The temperature dropped to 28 degrees below 0 Fahrenheit, a number that meant little on its own. With the wind, the cold was a physical weapon, a force that could freeze exposed flesh in minutes. The official term was wind chill, a concept the settlers understood in their bones. It was a cold that felt like it could shatter steel. For 8 days, the world vanished. There was no sun, no horizon, only a roaring, swirling vortex of white. The settlers locked themselves inside their cabins, which had become besieged fortresses. The wind was a living thing, a predator testing every wall, every seam. It forced the fine, sharp snow through the smallest cracks, around window frames and under door sills. The sound was incessant, a high-pitched scream that frayed the nerves. Inside the Miller cabin, the fight for warmth was desperate. They had stuffed every remaining crack with wool from an old blanket, but the wind still howled through the floorboards. Their stove burned continuously, consuming their woodpile at an alarming rate. John Miller ventured out once to the woodpile, a rope tied around his waist leading back to the door, and returned 20 minutes later, his beard a solid mass of ice, his lungs aching from the sheer cold of the air. Inside, the windows were completely blind with frost, more than an inch thick. His wife, Mary, tried to make bread, but the sourdough starter in its crock, left on a table 10 feet from the stove, had frozen into a solid, yellowish brick. It was dead. They huddled around the stove, wrapped in everything they owned, and listened to the storm try to tear their house apart. 500 yards away inside Mykola Pohrebnyak's earthen hill, the world was quiet. The 60-mile-per-hour gale, a deafening roar outside, was reduced to a distant, muffled hum, the sound of a faraway sea. There were no drafts. The small, deep-set windows were clear of frost, showing only the swirling chaos of the blizzard beyond the thick glass. Mykola's small stove glowed with a steady, moderate fire. He had to feed it only a few logs every few hours. The air was warm and still, holding at a steady 65 degrees. The proof of this impossible warmth was sitting on a simple wooden shelf against the curved inner wall. It was Olena's sourdough starter, a living culture she had carried all the way from Ukraine, housed in an earthenware crock. The night before, she had fed it flour and water. Now, in the gentle, radiant warmth emanating from the massive earthen wall, the starter was alive and active. It had doubled in size, its surface bubbling with the slow, steady work of yeast, a sign of life, of fermentation, of normalcy in the heart of a storm that was freezing the world solid. The numerical contrast was stark. 93 degrees of separation between the inside and the outside, from 65 degrees Fahrenheit to minus 28 degrees Fahrenheit. But the image was more powerful. In the conventional cabin, life froze. In the earthen hill, life rose. Olena took the bubbling starter and began to mix her dough for the day's bread, her movements calm and unhurried, as if it were a pleasant spring morning. On the 6th day of the blizzard, Asa Crittenden found himself in mortal danger. He had been in the county seat when the storm hit, and had grown increasingly worried about a survey team he had left working near the head of the valley. Against all advice, he'd set out on his sturdiest horse, believing he could follow the creek bed. It was a disastrous miscalculation. The blizzard's whiteout was absolute, a disorienting void that erased all landmarks. The creek was buried under yards of snow. His horse, spooked by the wind, threw him and bolted, disappearing into the swirling whiteness. His compass spun uselessly, tricked by the iron-rich local rock and the static in the air. His transit, strapped to his back, was a 30-pound anchor of ice. He was lost, freezing, and beginning to succumb to the fatal lethargy of hypothermia. He stumbled on, driven by pure instinct, knowing that to stop moving was to die. He was no longer thinking, just shuffling his feet through the drifts. Then, through the chaos, he saw a shape. It was a low, dark mound, a small hill where he was sure no hill should be. His surveyor's mind, even in its fogged state, registered the anomaly. But his survival instinct saw only shelter. He thought it was a large, unusually shaped snowdrift, perhaps formed against a rock outcropping, a place to get out of the wind. He carried his surveyor's rod, a long, slender pole of hickory tipped with brass. It was a tool for measuring, for finding solid ground. He used it now as a probe, to test the depth of the snowbank he was staggering towards. He plunged it into the drift. This was the moment of vindication. Crittenden's entire professional life was built on a set of certainties: the hardness of frozen earth, the predictable behavior of materials under stress, the unyielding laws of physics as he understood them. He expected the rod to punch through the top layer of snow and then stop with a hard, jarring shock against the frozen ground beneath. But that is not what happened. The rod sliced through the 4 feet of snow, and then, instead of stopping, it continued downward with a soft, thick, yielding resistance. There was no jar, no shock. It was a feeling he had never experienced in a Dakota winter. It felt like pushing a stick into a barrel of thick grease. He stopped, confused. He pulled the rod out. His hand, numb inside its frozen leather glove, slid down the wood to the tip. The brass was not coated in ice or snow. It was smeared with a dark, damp substance. He brought it closer to his face. It was mud, and it was warm. A faint vapor rose from it in the minus 28 degrees Fahrenheit air. The warmth, a ghost of energy, traveled up the metal and wood, a tiny, impossible message to his frozen fingers. In that instant, the fog in his brain cleared, replaced by a stunning, world-altering clarity. This was not a hill. This was not a snowdrift. This was Pohrebnyak's folly, and the mud was warm. His own prediction, so logical, so certain, that the mud would freeze and crack, was wrong. The entire structure was alive with heat. He had stumbled not upon a shelter from the storm, but into the storm's absolute opposite. He let the rod fall and began clawing at the snow with his hands, searching for the door he now knew, with the certainty of a saved man, had to be there. He found the stone lintel, the wooden door, and collapsed against it, his last ounce of strength spent. The door opened. A wave of calm, quiet warmth washed over him, smelling of baked bread and dry straw. Mykola Pohrebnyak stood there, his face etched with concern, and helped the county surveyor inside, out of the screaming wind and into the silent, steady peace of the hill. Crittenden had measured the world in frozen lines. Mykola had measured it in hours of warmth. The blizzard finally broke on the 9th day. The wind died, and a weak, pale sun revealed a world transformed, sculpted into fantastic drifts and dunes of white. The silence was as profound as the storm's noise had been. When Asa Crittenden finally emerged from the Pohrebnyak home, restored by 3 days of warmth and Olena's food, he was a changed man. He had entered the blizzard as a man of theory and left it as a man of witness. He had not just been proven wrong, he had been saved by the very thing he had dismissed. He returned to his office in the county seat, his mind replaying the impossible sensation of that warm mud. A month later, it was time to finalize the official plat map for the Spring Creek Valley survey. He unrolled the heavy linen paper, took out his drafting pens and India ink, and began to render the homesteads, roads, and section lines into their final permanent form. When he arrived at Township 109 North, Range 78 West, he came to Mykola Pohrebnyak's quarter section. The standard protocol was to draw a small, perfect square and label it dwelling. Crittenden paused. A square did not represent what stood on that land. A square was a box of cold air and cracked walls. He picked up his compass and a different pen. He drew a long, curved shape, an arch. Then he carefully lettered a notation next to it, a phrase that had never before appeared on a government survey map in the Dakota Territory. He wrote, "Pohrebnyak structure warm." It was an official act of vindication. Over the following year, as new settlers arrived to file their claims, they would unroll the master plat at the courthouse to see the available land. They would see that strange curved shape and its even stranger label. "What's this warm structure?" a German farmer might ask the county clerk. And the clerk, who had heard the story directly from Crittenden, would tell them about the surveyor who nearly froze to death but was saved by the Ukrainians' mud hill. The story, legitimized by its presence on an official map, spread not as rumor, but as practical advice. The following spring, 3 families, 2 German and 1 Norwegian, began digging clay pits of their own. By 1899, the surveyor's map had served as a blueprint for more than a dozen such structures across the county, each a testament to a truth that had been demonstrated, not argued. Mykola Pohrebnyak was practicing a building science that modern architects would call an earth-sheltered passive thermal envelope. His materials were ancient, a gift of the riverbed and the harvest field, but his grasp of thermodynamics was centuries ahead of the timber frame construction of his day. The principles he employed, high thermal mass, minimal air infiltration, and passive heat storage, are now the cornerstones of advanced green building design. There was a fundamental difference in philosophy at play on that Dakota prairie. The American settlers, with their thin-walled cabins and roaring stoves, saw winter as an enemy to be fought, an invading force to be held at bay by a barrier. Theirs was the logic of the fortress, a constant, exhausting battle against the cold. They built a wall against winter. Mykola Pohrebnyak built no such thing. He held a deeper understanding, one born on the steppes of his homeland. He knew you could not defeat the winter, but you could cooperate with the principles of warmth. His structure was not a wall. It was a vessel. It was a great earthen battery designed to slowly absorb the heat of a small fire and the memory of the summer sun still latent in the earth, and to hold that warmth within its heavy embrace. He didn't build a wall against winter. He built a hill that held the summer inside it. It wasn't a defense. It was a reservoir of comfort, releasing its stored energy slowly and generously through the longest, coldest nights. Thank you for joining us on this journey into the past. If you found this story of ingenuity and resilience valuable, please consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel for more explorations of forgotten wisdom. Your engagement is the fuel that allows us to keep these stories alive. We'll see you next time. The content of this video is for educational and storytelling purposes only. The characters, names, and specific events depicted are fictionalized for narrative effect, though the building techniques and scientific principles are based on real historical practices. Any application of these or similar techniques today should be undertaken only after consulting with qualified professionals and in accordance with modern building codes, safety standards, and local regulations. This video does not constitute professional, technical, or legal advice.